I'm super happy to have Teresa back with us today for our second session. And you know, when Teresa and I were planning this, one of the goals was for us to really come up with a way for us to focus on like an embodied experience of talking about all of these ideas. And also, based on the feedback that we got from folks who were in the room for the first session, one of the things that came up was a lot of questions and a lot of kind of like percolation around our own self-regulation, right? And how to support that, how to support sustainability and doing work that can be incredibly taxing, but also like what our self-regulation has to do with our capacity to help the young people in our classes regulate themselves. So that was like the launching off point for this session. And we also wanted it to be really grounded in your experience in the classroom, which was why we wanted to really start with a couple of stories from you about some experiences that felt like maybe self-regulation was a little bit of a challenge in the moment, right? Because it's not about never feeling activated, right? Or never being dysregulated ourselves, but it's about noticing and then having tools to kind of support coming back to regulation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to you, Teresa.
Okay. Thanks, Jessica. So I'm really glad to be here, and as Jess said, I would like to start actually with hearing if any of you have any sort of scenario you'd like to share of a time that you've been teaching and have found it difficult to sort of manage your own self-regulation. And I'm asking for these because throughout the class, what we're planning to do today is for a little while, maybe 20 or 30 minutes or something, I will just explain a little bit about the nervous system and regulation, and I can use those as reference points to help sort of give some practical examples of how these things come alive in our experience. And then for the rest of the time, I wanted us to do some experiential exercises that might be helpful for you guys when you're teaching, because they're sort of tools that you can use. So would anybody like to share an instance where they were aware, like, wow, I noticed that something happened to me while I was teaching, or between me and my students, and I could have used some support.
So I used to teach at Ella McQueen, which is a detention center in Brooklyn, and it wasn't so much like it wasn't with the students. This was one of the staff, mm-hmm. and one of the staff who has kind of felt like competition with the program or just competition with other adults, that because he kind of wants to be the one the kids like. Mm-hmm. And this is my observation and judgment, but over the course of many years being there, it was consistent. And so he would never participate in class, but he would kind of in his own way recruit students to come to class. But then he'd sometimes make comments during class, especially if a pose looked gay to him. Or if a young person, like for example, a young person was in a twist one time, and I was like, where do you feel it in the body? And the boy was like, oh, I feel it in my butt. And he was like, whoa, and so and it was just kind of one of those things, like how do you manage, my kind of impatience with him, like come on, like you're an adult in the room, like be an adult and stop being homophobic, right? And so it's kind of, again, my judgment, I don't know if he's homophobic, right? But just kind of like feeling that rise up, and then kind of not really doing anything about it, right? Because it was just sort of like he's a staff person, like he just makes comments once in a while. But I remember like at one class it kind of became a thing because he made his whoa comment, and then the young man kind of just like shut down and like kind of didn't want to participate anymore, and I tried to like reorient the class and things like that. And so I ended up talking to my supervisor, like my site contact person there. And then I was like, what do you think I should do? Like, I'd like to talk to the staff person myself, but I can never be one-on-one with him because he's always with students and I'm not, walking the building by myself. So in that instance, just like kind of noticing in myself, like, okay, like it was kind of rising up each time I saw him. And then how do I manage a staff person when it's not actually has anything to do with the young people? So that's kind of in general, kind of like a thing, but then also in my own regulation, really feeling that.
Yeah. Is that something that you guys relate to? Yeah.
I co-sign on that. I was thinking, at my current site, like I feel like I'm able to regulate myself and have tools when I see the guys that I work with. So if they're really energetic, I meet them with a movement strategy. I find myself more empathetic in those situations and able to harness tools. But I think one thing that I personally find myself getting unregulated around is the lack, it's not badly intentioned, I don't feel, but the lack of self-awareness of other adults in the room around the energy and even the volume that they're infusing into the space. At the site that I'm in, there's like even like the entering into yoga of like, you gotta calm down, get into yoga, and like entering, like the students entering that way, or the adults being there and they're like, oh, I need this so much, but they're like really, like they're the loudest, most distracted folks in the room, but they don't mean to be. I find it more difficult to manage that or to bring awareness to that, because I feel like one, is that my place, or and also just I think it's just a total lack of awareness on the adults, and like they're not aware that they're bringing that energy in there.
And can I just ask, just to deepen that? Thank you for sharing that. So what happens to you? What do you feel inside yourself when you're in that situation?
It feels almost like I do feel like the heightened level of frustration. Like I feel it in my body. I was like, come on, like trying, like hoping that it will fix itself. It's like this little thing going.
Yes.
Yeah, like come on. And there's like a feeling of like impatience around it. Like I want to like suck my teeth at it. Like that's what it feels like. Like what are you doing?
Yeah.
And then like sometimes like a deer in headlights, like a little bit of thoughts, like not knowing what to do if you should say anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have something like
Yeah, I've been thinking, I've had two situations, not exactly working with Lineage, but I'm working with like teenagers who are court involved. And I've had two moments in my classroom where there was a fight, like a violent fight, like physical. So there are two things that I think dysregulated me in the moment. Obviously, like watching violence and not being able to do anything, because like how do you try to de-escalate when there are two kids on top of each other, and like you're not going to go like in the middle, you know, like so. Watching that, and then like the response from the adults around the whole situation, like making it about like what's the tone that you're setting in the classroom so that these things happen. And I really felt like frustrated and like this is not fair. Like we are talking about like kids who are coming from like, you know, all this context, and like I've worked with them for a week, and like they fought over something very, some of them, like one of them spilled a little bit of water, the other one got triggered, and it was really like nothing serious, but they're triggered about like different things, and it all came back to like it was my fault in a way. So it's like, how do you deal? Like I really felt frustrated, and I spoke with, you know, the person, and I was like, how do you do, like what do you do in those situations where there is something physical that's going on, but also like why is this my fault, and why is this about like the tone that I'm setting? Like how do you know, it's a very like I don't know. I think I've dealt with like 2 or 3 situations like that, and yeah, and it's very difficult because it's complicated, it's complex. It's not just like, you know. So yeah, I think that's what I was thinking of.
And could I ask you the same question, Camila, about what you were experiencing in your body when you were accused of having somehow caused this eruption? What was your inner
I
experience?
felt very angry and frustrated, to be honest. I was like, I even told the person, like, please give me some minutes because I cannot talk right now. Like, I need to retreat a little bit because I knew that I was getting very angry and frustrated about the whole situation. So I took some time and then I sat down, and I was still feeling angry and I was still feeling frustrated, but like I was able to talk from a different place. Still feeling the anger, still feeling the frustration, but like not in that point where I was like here.
Yeah.
So at that moment he was like, but we need to talk about this right now, and I was like, I can't. So yeah, it's very complex. So yeah.
That's really helpful, and I think like it's great that you had the self-awareness to know that I can't speak when I'm in a reactive state. I need to have a moment to settle myself, or a few moments. Yeah, because it wouldn't have been productive, I'm sure. Yeah. So actually you sounded pretty regulated. The fact that you knew that you had an observer with you to say, no, it's not time to talk yet.
Well, I cried, like I was hurt, like in the moment I was crying, and I said to him, I can't talk right now, I'm angry.
Yeah.
Right, but like the dysregulation came with the tears, with the like I need, like my body was all like. But yeah, then I think, like, thankfully I have the tools where I was like, okay, I'm gonna, you know, like I need a moment.
Yeah.
And I think that worked. Otherwise, I think it would have been a disaster. But yeah.
Adding on to that a bit, I do feel like a consistent, and it's an old like taken in message around anything that has to do with classroom management, and feeling that ignite in my body in spaces, managing or being expected to control young people. In my heart, I don't want to do that, and I know that, and but I feel like a literal internal tug and pull, feeling of judgment, wanting to shrink in certain situations where I know the expectation, and on top of it being watched doing it by other adults, feeling an expectation of needing to control young people, and either feeling incapable sometimes of doing it, not wanting to because knowing it's an injustice being pushed to do that and it does no one a service, but also feeling a sense of lack of strength by not being able to do it sometimes. I feel that tug and pull a lot throughout teaching in various settings, and it comes up. So it's like, what is the right thing to do? And what am I expected to do? How are people perceiving what I'm doing? How is it taken in by the young people? What's best for them?
Can I add something? So it's interesting. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I mean, I don't teach, as everyone knows, but I identify so much and have such a similar reaction. So I want to name this too, particularly when it has to do with like injustice. And I feel like in my job as an an administrator, I'm called to try to fight for something on behalf of like Lineage and our staff. So let's say something having to do with like pay or benefits or equity or something that I think is rooted in our values of like anti-oppression and racial justice and fairness and like the kind of organization I want us to be. And when I feel like that's challenged, particularly by people with authority who don't sort of have the day-to-day knowledge or lived experience or just like haven't worked in these kind of settings. And this comes up with the board often, and also sometimes with consultants who we might need to support ourselves. And I just had this actually come up on a call where the like very brief, but I think it will be an illustrative example. The federal government requires salary data to be put on a nonprofit's tax filing for people, for some employees. And the state and city have passed protection laws for that salary history because of a recognition that women in particular and people of color are disproportionately impacted throughout their lifetime when their salary history is known. But there's a tension between the city and state and federal filings, laws. And I was like raising this with our board and our finance committee and our consultants, and just like, you know, there was like understanding, but kind of like, we can't take this on. And like, it was like, we know this is personal to you, Gabrielle. And like, you know, and that was like from a consultant who was like not asked to opine on it. And, you know, people saying, and this same person was like, well, it happens to government employees also. And I was like, one injustice doesn't like make another. But I find myself getting so angry, so activated. I just start, you know, I'm an attorney by training, so I go into the like, I'm gonna like over argue you mode, which does not work. And I get very in my head, and like, if I just say this right and like passionate enough and like righteous enough, but can also be like smart enough, then I'm gonna show them that like I'm right, they're wrong, I have morality on my side, they don't. I get totally physically activated, angry, also sometimes cry. And like after this call, I was so angry I could like barely work, and I had to like call someone and have a conversation and just like, you know, take a walk, and like, because I was like, I can't even do my job because I'm so outraged at like the lack of understanding of power and privilege and justice and equality, and like, but it's, and I just really recognize like it's not helpful. Like I just make the situation worse, because when I get like that, A, it doesn't change the situation, and B, I get labeled as like the personal person who's like, you know, always like making these arguments and like, you know, doesn't see the whole, and like I lose credibility. And I think I also struggle, last thing I'll say, but like when do you, like when, how, like I don't want the alternative to be silence or accepting something that is unjust and unacceptable. And sometimes I feel like, well, if the price is that I get labeled or I lose political capital, that has to be the price, because I'm not going to be silent in the face of injustice. But I think if I could do it from a more self-aware, like embodied, regulated place in the moment, not later, I might actually be more persuasive. And I might also have more serenity, even if no one is persuaded, because I ultimately can't change anyone else. But I got so upset, and then it ruined, like, you know, I had to spend like 2 hours getting back into like an okay place.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think you kind of named it when you said the choices aren't necessarily doing what you just described or being silent, but figuring out how can I be responsive rather than reactive.
Yes.
Right? How can I be in my body enough that I get to make choices about the way I'm going to respond to this?
Yes.
Rather than just being driven, you know, sort of being taken over.
Yes. And when it has to do with justice, I'm just like a maniac. Like, I mean, I was like, I'm going to start a national conference. You know, it's like, I just like, it's like, boom, don't make me do something unjust.
Right. So how do you hold on to that energy and channel it in a way that where you get to make choices? Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. But that's what we're going to be talking about. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think there's one unifying theme throughout all of these is also being able to take in what do I have control over and what do I not have control over, and being able to accept that, you know, which is not easy. It's really challenging. So I think what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the nervous system and where we optimally would like to be, like what we want to have activated and what we want to work on sort of calming in our systems. And I know some of you are familiar with this, and I think I talked about it also a little bit last time, but this concept is known as the polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges. And it's a relatively new way of understanding the nervous system since the 90s, I would say. It's been developed more and more. And it used to be that people thought we had a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system. And, you know, the kind of shorthand for that is, you know, you can think of sympathetic, S for stress, and, you know, kind of activation, and parasympathetic, P for peace, you know, settle, quiet. So, and people believed that it was kind of like a seesaw. Like if you were, you know, if sympathetic was up, parasympathetic was down, and it just toggled like that. So what Porges proposed, and you know, because neuroscience is a constantly growing field, I would never say like this is definitely the fact, because I don't think they really know. But it is a widely accepted theory now, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Is that there are actually not 2 but 3 branches to our autonomic nervous system, and the way we can understand them is in terms of their evolutionary hierarchy. So the most modern part of the autonomic nervous system it's called ventral vagal, and ventral just meaning the front. So that, you know, just because it comes from the front of the vagus nerve. But the easier kind of term for this part of the system is called the social engagement system. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the when your social engagement system is the predominant. We never have only one of these activated. It's always a blend of things. But when the predominant part of our nervous system that's active is the social engagement system, we are feeling safe in our environment. We're transmitting a feeling of safety to the people around us. And it's definitely a dynamic. So when we're feeling that the people around us are safe, then it helps us stay in social engagement, and we in turn give off a feeling of safety, so others feel okay, you know, engaging with us. And the part of the body that's most closely affiliated with this is the upper in here. So it's jaws, the middle ear, actually, larynx, pharynx. The way our voice sounds is very involved with the social engagement system, the prosody of our voice, and an ability to move, like this part of the body. So if you think about it, if you wanted to look around the room, you could either look around moving your head and your neck and kind of rotating and looking up and looking down. That's one way of looking around the room. Another way of looking around the room is to keep your head perfectly straight and just move your eyes. When I do that, what does that communicate to you? Fear. Exactly. So when you are in a fear state, you're immobilized up here. That's what I just wanted to illustrate, right? But when you're feeling safe, you've got fluidity up here and you can move. The very kind of short, caption here is that in order for us to stay regulated, what we want to do is to try to keep ourselves in our social engagement system. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is ways that we can do that. So what's interesting is that our nervous system privileges defensive response. So social engagement system, actually, our tendency to go into fight or flight mode when we're threatened that's a survival strategy, right? That's how we got this far evolutionarily. And the social engagement system, which is the most modern development in our nervous system, actually inhibits the fight or flight response. It holds it down. So, and without it, we tend to be much more reactive. And So just going, backwards through the hierarchy of the nervous system, the next older system that came before social engagement is our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight response. So that's a threat response that is all about mobilization. When you're in fight or flight, all the systems of your body are mobilized to defend yourself. And so your muscles are tense, your endocrine system is pumping out stress hormones like adrenaline so you can move fast, cortisol. There's a bunch of different hormones that we secrete when we're having a big sympathetic charge in the fight or flight. But that is like, we're ready to go, I'm gonna run or I'm gonna fight. And then the oldest part of the nervous system is what's called the dorsal vagal, dorsal meaning back, like the dorsal fin on a dolphin, and that's also because it comes out of the back side of the vagus nerve. So there's this very long nerve that goes all along our spinal cord, and the ventral vagal, which is connected to social engagement, is high up. The dorsal vagal comes from the rear of the vagus nerve, and it's lower down, and so it controls mostly diaphragm and below. So it's, and that is when we're in the extreme end, or what's called high tone dorsal vagal. That is the freeze response. That is an immobility response, and that's the very last resort of our defensive threat response system. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we do is we gear up for fighting or fleeing, and then if that doesn't work, we go into a freeze response. And that can be a rigid, deer in the headlights kind of a response, or it can be a collapsed, limp, like the way possums play dead. It's a feigning death. And it's an oxygen conservation response. We're using very little oxygen. It's a state in which our body can't do its normal housekeeping tasks. We can't. It's very hard on the immune system, for instance, for people who are stuck in that for a long period of time, because basically it's like a total survival response where all you're trying to do is stay alive and be as still as you can. And it's very depleting for the system. Mm-hmm. So, however, I just want to make it clear that these, for us to not be black and white about these things, because the dorsal vagal nervous state, when that's active, so what I just described was high tone dorsal vagal, when you're like in kind of at the far end of the spectrum of that response. Low tone dorsal vagal is just, when you're resting on the couch after dinner. Like, in other words, there are times when you're immobile and it's not a fear response, right? If you're breastfeeding a baby, you're sitting pretty still, but it's not a fear response, right? If you're sitting quietly, watching TV or reading a book or snoozing, kind of going in and out of a snooze, that's predominantly dorsal vagal, but it's low tone. It's a state of relaxation. You're not animated and lively like in social engagement, but so I just want to make it clear that none of these systems are good or bad. They have elements that we need for every circumstance of our lives. The same with sympathetic. The fight or flight state of the sympathetic system is a threat response. But other kinds of stimulation that we experience are also sympathetic, but they're completely functional. Like when we're learning things, we're lively, our minds are lively, we're thinking hard, we're challenging ourselves. If you're dancing, you're active, you're mobile. That's not a threat response. We utilize different aspects of these, and I just wanted to make that clear. Maybe we could pass these out, because I have a couple of things that might be helpful.
Teresa, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, did you say that, like in Shavasana or like kind of deep relaxation, that is
That would
the
be
like
low
low
tone.
tone dorsal vagal?
Yes. Yes.
Can I have a question
Uh-huh.
too, if it's not okay, fine.
Yeah, sure.
Do you think like for, like, let's say the sort of free emotional or cognitive state that is more, I don't want to say metaphorical, but maybe more abstract, like someone who has something very difficult to do that's anxiety provoking and they don't do it, right? Like someone who needs to apply for a public benefit and a lot rides on it and it's very emotionally loaded and so they just like don't go to the appointment.
Uh-huh.
Right, but it's like something like that where there's actually like paralysis on taking an action because something is threatening.
That's a freeze response. Yeah, because if you're being immobilized, even if it's not literally like this, but you're not moving forward to do the thing you need to do, that is a kind of freeze response. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
I think what I would like you to do is to take a look at this page that's got the blue on it. Here, do you need another one, Chip? No. Okay. And this is sort of what I was getting at when I was saying that they're not good or they're not bad. They're just these different states. We can look at their normal functions, and then we can also look at their stress responses, and they're different. So if you're in social engagement, if you're feeling generally pretty regulated and comfortable and safe, and then something happens that threatens you, then one of the things that you can do if you're in social engagement is to ask someone to help you, right? If you're in a freeze response, and something threatening happened, you might just shut down and not talk to anybody. Or if you're in a fight or flight response, you might get up and, punch somebody. But if you're in social engagement and there's stress that arises, you can turn to your neighbor and say, "Wow, I need help. Can you help me?" That's a socially engaged response, right? In the lower under stress responses, the ANS. That I was just mentioning the in crisis contact and communication. That's asking for help. First aid, reaching out to help someone who you see is in distress. Tend and befriend, offering them empathy, offering them touch, or receiving those things. All of these things are situations in which you're experiencing stress, but you're not in fight or flight and you're not in freeze. You're in a more functional state.
What does mob behaviors mean?
Well, this is showing how one of these states can kind of bleed over into the other.
Mm-hmm. So
mob behaviors would be like if you're in a group and then all of a sudden the whole group together, let's say, decides to attack somebody. It's a social, people are acting in a social way as part of a group, but they're going into a sympathetic fight or flight state as a group. So these arrows, these sideways arrows, are illustrating how you can move from one predominant state to another. In sympathetic, when you're not stressed, you can learn things, you can you can walk to the subway, you can get yourself dressed, you can have sex, you can, digest well. Like all of those things are part of your, when you're in a non-stressed sympathetic state, that is supporting all kinds of activities that require mobilization. When you're in parasympathetic, as I was mentioning before, and you're not stressed, but you're feeling okay, that's when you can do the rest and rebuild. You can lie down on the couch, take some deep breaths, relax. You can meditate. They've kind of, on this chart, he's divided sexual activity into the different states, and I actually am not exactly sure how he does that, so I can't fully explain that. But sleep is a dorsal vagal state. So I'm just wondering, as you take a look at this, do you have any questions? Is it reasonably clear?
I kind of have it's like a comment question about the work that Lineage does, and just, I mean, any meditation teachers who are working in like high stress environments, and like basically like activating, like supporting people to kind of activate their parasympathetic nervous systems in an intentional way. And do you think a lot of that work is about making the parasympathetic almost like okay for people? Like I wonder if people who have been traumatized, if the parasympathetic is a terrifying place a lot of the time, because maybe they've been in freeze responses before. So any kind of, like deactivated state is scary. So is a lot of this like helping make that safe?
Well, that's a great question. I mean,
Yeah.
I do think a lot of people who are in a constantly activated state, or who aren't accustomed to feeling safe, or who don't believe that they are safe in a room full of other people, might really be uncomfortable going into a deeply relaxed state.
Yes.
That's a really good point. And so I think, we talked a little bit about this in the first workshop, in terms of, what if people can't tolerate really calming down, And so one of the things we talked about was titrating that, like offering people ways to either just do it for a moment, or do it in a way that is feels more bearable to them. Like, keep your eyes open, and if you want to sit up, you can sit up. Like, do whatever you need to do. But if you can experience even sort of like a molecule of sitting in your own space and feeling okay, that's an accomplishment. If you can take one full breath and feel like it really moves through your body, that's an accomplishment, right? So I think for some people, going into a deeply relaxed state would be terrifying. Absolutely, yeah.
I think what we try to do in our Lineage classes is to set this all up, right? Especially, like, I'm thinking in terms of even our model, when we start with discussion, that's social engagement, right? And then we do like movement, which is like activating the sympathetic nervous system, and then getting into meditation is a place to go into the dorsal vagal. So it's kind of trying to set it up to create the container of safety, so that the person can have then an individual feeling of it. But I often, like in my classes, like when we get to meditation, the young people are like, I feel really sleepy, or I'm tired. And it's like, for me, it's like a sign that their sympathetic nervous system has been so activated that the first thing they go to is like, I want to sleep.
Yeah.
Right? The first time they get their like dorsal vagal like is able to kind of like come online, they're like, and so it's just kind of like an interesting thing to look at in terms of like, how do you explain that then to a young person, to like, so that it's normalized and like, yeah, it's like totally legit if you're like tired, right? Because otherwise they're like, oh, I don't want to meditate. Not maybe even like I don't feel safe. It's like, why would I want to go from like here to here?
Right.
Why would I want like that spike down, spike up feeling in my body, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's a great point about, how by having a conversation at the beginning of the class, you're basically creating a social engagement kind of environment, right? And that includes, and I know I've seen you do this, like joking with people, like making them feel that, they can express themselves here. This place is for you. You can be comfortable. Giving this kind of sense of communicating to people that it's a safe place as much as it can be.
Yeah.
I'm always hesitant to use the word safe, because for some people there's nothing that's safe, but relatively safe. Yeah. So I wanted to, these other pages are really just sort of showing you a little bit more about the one with the colorful, the green and pink and gray, gives you some idea of what's happening in the body in these different states. so this just kind of deepens, you know, how we can picture these different states. And I actually brought a couple of little things along, like this guy here. That's fight or flight. That's sympathetic. Like,
Can you do that again?
Yeah. Yes. This is. He's fully in sympathetic, right? And this guy here is feeling pretty good, but then he goes into collapse. So this, you know, this state, this is kind of a nice, I think it's just a nice way to picture that, you know, when you're going along and then something happens that makes you feel threatened, and what your system does is this. That's a freeze response. Just can't deal with it. And I mean, I've certainly seen this in my office a lot, where people just kind of crumple, you know. And of course, sometimes it is a deer in headlights rather than a collapse, but it's basically the same part of the nervous system. That's a dorsal response. And what we're really going for, I always feel like the slinky is just a good example of having some flexibility in our system, having some fluidity, not being compressed all the way where where this is very rigid and we've got no space for anything. And we also don't want to be pulled out all the way where we again are in a very rigid state. But being able to have some wiggle in the slinky is kind of what we're going after. We need some wiggle in the slinky. Yeah. Yeah. And another way I sometimes think about it is with using the Hoberman sphere. You know, that if you're really shut down, you're like this. And if you're totally activated, you're like this. And what we really want is to be able to have some movement, some breath, some fluidity, right?
What is that called?
It's called a Hoberman sphere. I guess it was invented by Mr. Hoberman. I don't know. Yeah. But so I just, you know, sometimes it's helpful to have a visual of what we're going for. So one of the things that's really, hang on, I just want to check, see how we're doing on time. Okay, that's important to keep in mind is that nervous systems are really contagious. And so whatever you're feeling is going to affect the rest of the room, right? Just as what other people are feeling. Like some of you talked about, in fact, I think all of you mentioned the adults in the room when you're at a class. And it sounds like they're often very activated, like whether it's because they feel that their authority is being challenged by having an outside teacher come in, your rules might be different, your tone might be different, you know, or maybe they're just skeptical about yoga and they think the whole thing is stupid, or who knows, or maybe they're just angry and it's just everywhere they go. And so that's kind of, it's a little bit like some toxic energy that's in the room with you. And so I guess the question is, what can you do to maximize what you're giving out from your own energy and your own state? Because of course you can't control those adults. They're coming with whatever they're coming with. But if you are, however much regulation you have in your own system is going to contribute to co-regulating the people around you, including the adults, you know. And the students are going to be, I mean, everybody really, but the students in particular, since they're going to be more looking up to you probably as an adult and as a teacher, are going to be kind of borrowing your regulation. Whatever you have, it's kind of like you're kind of like you're putting out a platter, like here's dinner. You know, I'm coming here with my regulation, I'm offering it to you. And you just do this through your own self-regulation and your intention and awareness, you know. And I'm sure that all of you have had the experience of seeing how much impact that can have, right? Not to say that everybody's going to calm down the minute they're around you at all. But that the more you can stay in yourself and feel grounded and regulated, the more that's going to start to create a feeling in the room. Does that sound true?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought we could try a few exercises that might help. So I guess when I was thinking about the experiential stuff we could do today, I was thinking, what are some things that you could take with you into a classroom that might help you regulate yourself? And possibly things that you could also do with your students if you feel like they're helpful. And the first one is actually that orienting that we kind of did briefly a few moments ago when I was looking around the room and moving my head. And so one thing to do is when you get into a classroom, even if you've been there a bunch of times before, to take a moment and just literally look around the room, making sure that you're moving your head and your neck, not just your eyes. And maybe everybody could take a moment and do that right now. And you know, even though we're in a room that doesn't have a lot of like fabulous landmarks in it, which I'm sure many of your teaching classrooms don't either, just see if you can find 3 things that your eyes just seem to want to land on. Without staring or making your eyes hard, just keep your eyes soft. And remember to breathe as you're doing it. Keep breathing. So, does anybody want to just say, like, what are 3 things you noticed as you did that?
Notice like in the body or
I noticed around you, what that you saw. Yeah.
What did we
Yeah, that you.
The balls and the lights.
Yeah, the ones that aren't lit up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I realize I must be hungry because I noticed the banana over there and the sparkling water. And I was kind of drawn to the food. Yeah. I wonder how it would be, I'm curious, if you asked your students to start with that at the beginning of a class. Just because even if they've been in that room a lot of times, they probably come in activated and they never really look around. So that's something that you could try, you know.
One thing that I noticed was that I was drawn to, well, I actually 4 things, but 2 of them were mine. So like that tea cup and then my lunch sack. And I noticed that I felt like a sense of like connection and like landing, like, oh, there's my tea mug, like, oh, that's my thing, and that made me feel comforted. And then it made me like, I'm thinking now that especially the kids we work with who are incarcerated or in justice facilities or homeless shelters, like they don't often have very much, if any, personal possessions. They're not allowed to.
Right.
And I just like made this connection in a deeper way, like an embodied way of like, oh, I take so much comfort in seeing my stuff. Like when you said, what do your eyes want to look at? 2 of the 4 things were mine.
Yes.
And then they felt warm. And what would it be like to be in a place where you're living, incarcerated living, right? And you have almost nothing that belongs to you.
Yeah.
That isn't given to you by the state or the city and
Right.
standard issue.
Right, yeah.
And I mean, I obviously, like, I've thought of this before, but it really made me think in a more embodied way, like, what does that do to the body and the nervous system and the mind and the ability to land in a setting?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point, yeah. I know that in my therapy office, it's not unusual that somebody will, come in every week and sit down in the same place. And then, like, one day, months later, they'll say, oh, did you get a new picture? And that picture's been there the whole time. They just never oriented, you know? So, actually, it does make you feel more grounded in your environment once you've done that. So,
kind of see that sometimes in the students, they're doing it, like to make sure that they, like just to check out danger and safety in the room,
Yes.
you know, like they're already kind of doing it, right? And so,
Right.
like in terms of like how we talk about how we set up our classroom is like how we lay out the mats, like that's super important, right? Like if the mats are already laid out, like they'll notice that. And I always think like, you know, how would this be for them to feel like, oh, I want to get on this mat, you know? So it's not just it's arbitrary, let's just like put the mats down, right?
Mhm,
Yeah,
right,
even
yeah.
that, because you're really like, I feel like, I feel like our students are scanning all the time, right?
Yeah.
But like if you're scanning for danger, it's a different thing to try to like scan to regulate your nervous system.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So if you, in even asking them, what do your eyes want to land on, some orients the question a little differently.
Mhm.
So you're asking them like, is there anything in here that feels good for you to look at?
Mm.
You're right, yeah.
Mm.
So you're kind of asking them to scan for safety
Mhm.
or for settling.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that I think might be useful, having heard that it seems like it's a pretty widespread thing that the adults and staff are particularly hard to deal with when they're teaching, is for us to do to create our own bubbles. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we're going to do this. Because this is a tool that you could really use, you know, every time you go into a room to teach. And you can use it anywhere, on the subway, you know. And what I would like you to think about is imagining that you have a bubble, a 360 sphere, goes all the way around you, above you, below you. And it has segments like an orange. So just kind of picture that there's all these segments in it. And I'd like you to take a moment or two, and if you want to close your eyes, you can, and just picture what you would like your bubble to be like. What would you like it to be made of? It could be any material you want. What would you like to have in that bubble with you? Where are you in the bubble? Are you right in the middle? Are you near the back? Like where do you feel most comfortable in there? So just take a couple minutes and think of Would it be okay if we talk a little bit about this? Okay. Would anyone like to share what that was like for you? What your bubble was like? Sorry?
Amazing.
Amazing. Oh, would you share it?
I instantly went to like a lot of plants,
Oh.
very green, like almost like a little forest with sounds of the ocean and like little lights, and yeah, like it felt very safe and comforting to visualize that. Yeah, it was very, especially when you think about moving around the city the whole day, not even in class, but just like commuting from
Yeah.
one class to another, like what does it mean to have your own bubble? Sometimes you need it in the city, like just to visualize that. So it really felt comforting. Yeah,
Great. Would it be okay if I ask you a few things about it?
of course.
Okay. So how big was it? How much room was there between your body and the outside of the bubble?
There was like, it was
Arm's reach?
yeah, like, yeah, a little more maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be as big as a building,
Yeah.
and however big you need it. But
No, it was
it's-
not very big, but it
Okay.
was enough for me to move
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. And where were you located in the building?
in the middle.
In the middle. Okay. And did you have anything? Well, you had a forest in there. so-
Yeah, like plants and
Yeah. Sounds wonderful.
yeah, it was amazing.
And I'm just curious if you picture yourself in there. If you take a kind of sense into the area behind you, and just check and see, like, does it feel kind of equally comfortable to you at the back, at the sides, at the front? Just notice whether there's any difference in how it feels in terms of your protection
Yeah, I think it feels safer
in the front.
in the front.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering, and what's the material on the outside of the bubble? Do you know?
It's all plants.
It's all plants,
It's
okay.
like foresty.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering if there's anything you could add to fortify the back of the bubble so
Hmm.
that it feels just as comfortable as the front.
Maybe flowers?
Does that make it feel stronger?
Yeah, like flowers.
Okay.
And maybe more lights.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kind of a thicker layer?
Like a thicker layer. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And, okay, and what do you notice in your body as you picture that?
Like a sense of protection, of centering, of like grounding. Yeah. Yeah. More connection to like myself. Sometimes being in class when you have adults around or whatever, like there's an external voice or external like, what are you doing, you know, like especially when you have these relationships where, yeah, like the one that I explained before, where you're being like watched, not in a very compassionate way, but like kind of like seeing where are you gonna like fall down. So it's like, how do you protect yourself from that and believe, like be confident about your own voice and the things that you're bringing into the space. And sometimes it's difficult, right, when someone is watching and when it's like, but it's like, it's there. It's like, how do you connect to that despite like the moments where like everything around you seems to be a little bit hectic. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share what their bubble experience was?
My bubble was trippy.
Trippy?
It was like a weird place to be. So a couple of things kept coming up. You know those like those balls that there's like a pole and then it like spins. Like I kept visualizing myself as like something connecting me top to bottom, and I was the pole, and then the ball was spinning around me. And it was very small, so like I could touch the top with my head and the bottom with my bottom, and I was in the center. And then around, like the material was either spinning really fast, or I can like reach out to it. And it's the material of like those jelly shoes, like those sparkly jelly shoes, that were like kind of like porous and sticky and flexible. So like I would reach out, and it would be still but like sticky. And then I would also feel like this wanting to fall back into something, but I couldn't. So that was, I wanted to explore it more,
Yeah.
because that's just what came up.
And were you right in the middle?
Right in the middle, but it like,
Yeah, you didn't have much space in there.
right.
Yeah.
But I wanted that, like I wanted to feel, I think I needed to feel held,
Yes.
like that, with everything else going around.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it makes sense to me that it would present that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's is different.
Mhm.
And can you imagine sort of conjuring that up for yourself before going into Lineage?
I kind of see myself as having to be like that. Like, how do I stay rooted, grounded, held in environments where things are all over? folks can reach out to me when and if they choose to. Yeah.
Anyone else want to say anything about theirs?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Like in the beginning, you asked us to like visualize a bubble and then have it segmented like an orange. What was the purpose of like the segmenting?
The purpose is so that you can notice where it might need more fortification. So like if you're thinking of it as not just one structure, but having these different segments, you might find that you like I've worked with people where they need to have like titanium at the back, where there's a place on the left that just doesn't feel right. So they have to find ways to seal that better. And so it just kind of breaks it down and makes it possible to really notice where in your body are you feeling just right, and is there somewhere that doesn't feel okay? Yeah. Yeah. One person imagined a bubble that was made out of like sort of sleeping bag material, and it had like tent zippers on each segment, and so she could open up like a little area if she wanted to, and then she could zip it back up. And yeah, people use like the material of lead aprons. Some people use metal. Some people use plexiglass. And what's so beautiful is it's just completely whatever resonates for you. And then noticing if there's something that still isn't feeling right, what do you need to do to strengthen that? And I think one of the ways I think this can be helpful if you use this, say, when you're teaching, is because it helps give you that little bit of space of kind of protection, so that if you can see an adult over there, some staff person who you get the feeling is being judgmental toward you, you've kind of got the space of your bubble to figure out, okay, how do I want to filter that? How do I want to respond to that? Rather than just feeling totally exposed to it. If that makes sense. Yeah. I'm curious, is this an exercise that you can imagine doing with your students? Yeah? I mean, you can get really elaborate. Especially I've noticed teens often have a lot of ideas about things they want to have in their bubble with them. And, like I always say, no other people, but you can have, if there are things that are important to you, because this is really about your personal space. And so, people sometimes want to just have special items that are meaningful to them. And anything that...
I did a lot of that. That's why I'm laughing. I'm like, am I like a teenager?
That's great, though. You did. Yeah. So you had some ideas about things.
Yeah, but I don't want to interrupt. I just want to explain why I was laughing.
Fine. Yeah. So, yeah, it also, I would imagine that people who are living in a detention center, would certainly need a bubble. And so it might be helpful to the youth who work with that. Another thing I'm wondering about is, do you guys have any issues with when a class is over and it was difficult? How do you leave that behind you? Like, how do you kind of let go of whatever was, making you feel bad in that moment? No. So that's interesting. So what helps you release that?
It was my own personal work around boundaries for myself. That's very new. It's like I promised to show up fully in that time, but it's just like a mindset. Let it go once it's done. Once that time is done. I used to not be able to do that. Also, I do this. Even just sometimes I'll try to pat it out of my body. I have things that calm me down immediately that I can listen to in my ears right when I leave.
You mean like music or?
Yeah, like music, or it depends if I need something more calming, if it's like an intense thing, some sort of like walk or movement can help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that wasn't always the case.
So you really set an intention to try to figure out how to.
I've had to.
Yeah.
It has to be like, it's been like a non-negotiable, I feel, for me to maintain sustainability in the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not feeling bad about that.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
great. What about you guys? I mean, how do you feel about that? Like, do you have your own rituals for sort of how you leave things away? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I have like my own tools and practices. Like I think the more I have a practice outside of my work, the more it helps me in work, right? My personal practice. And then I have support systems. Like I know I can call someone, or I can music, movement, discharge. I mean, like I talk to my nervous system,
Mhm.
you know. So I think it's, yeah,
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah. Seems really important to have
Yeah.
your own strategies. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I circle back for a second
Sure.
and ask about this bubble?
Yeah.
Because I'm imagining like perhaps using it as like a bubble meditation. Like if I was going to do this with my young people.
Mhm.
So I just want to kind of, because I know you have like clients, so you do this one-on-one, and it's like it was really beautiful to watch the kind of interaction between you and Camila with the follow-up questions and stuff. So just thinking about it as an experience, since we're not clinicians, to make sure that we're offering it in a way that's titrated. So like in your experience, has anything come up in terms of like people feeling triggered or like not safe, or feeling that the bubble's not working for them, and like how would we deal with that in a group setting as non-clinicians?
Mhm. Yeah, that is a really good question. Well, I think one thing that comes to my mind is from the outset giving permission for people to experience this however it works for them. So, because I've certainly had also sat with people who just can't do it, like nothing, it doesn't resonate for me, you know, and like so, and that's fine. So letting them know, number one, this might or might not resonate for you, you know. I think offering it as a strategy that could be comforting. So more like, here I'm offering you a tool, you might find it helpful, you know, you can use it, you know, wherever you go. So for some people, their bubble is so close it's like saran wrap. For others, it's like the size of a big building. Anything goes, it's what works for you. So I think kind of really giving a lot of permission for people to experience it their own way.
I've done something with my students that when like, and I'm not a clinician, but I feel that also offering them the opportunity to, for example, draw that bubble. I think that art and just like drawing, like for me, it's one of the techniques that I use. Every time that I get out, like I draw. I draw my pictures, and I think that helps me. So maybe let them use other tools to create their own bubble, like draw it. You don't have to share it in the group.
Absolutely.
And I think that's also like a way that I feel that with my students have helped them to feel that they don't have to share, or they don't have to feel anything, just like have their own drawing or whatever. Yeah,
I think it's important that they don't have to share.
exactly.
Yeah. And another thing that might titrate it a little bit is you could say, like, if you find it hard to imagine yourself in a bubble right here, if you were in a place that felt really good and comfortable to you, you know, it might be on another planet, like wherever it is, can you picture what a bubble might look like for you there? You know? So giving them some space.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think it's also interesting that sometimes when people become more regulated, also what they want in their bubble changes. You know, it might change size, it might change material. I love the idea of drawing it. I have a friend who's an art therapist who does that with bubbles, and she'll just give the person lots of materials, and it's a good idea.
Yeah, it has worked a lot for me, and I'm not an art therapist or anything.
Yeah. Well, you don't have to be.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's like, how do you put it in paper? Helps
Yes.
for me a lot too.
Yeah.
Like journaling and drawing and
So another thing that I thought we could try, just to see how our time's going. Okay, we're good. Is the VOO sound, which is like if you spelled it, it would just be VOOOOO. And basically, it's kind of like impersonating a foghorn. Is what you're doing. So you're a foghorn, you know, that keeps the boat safe when they're in the harbor,
okay.
you know, if it's foggy. So we can try this together, and one thing that's helpful is to have a hand on your belly, because you might feel some vibration there. So it's just like this. So maybe we can try that together a few times, and you just take a natural in-breath, and the only thing to really keep in mind is that you want to go to the very end of your exhale when you do this. So nice long exhale, okay? Just take a moment and rest and notice what's happening inside your body. That's good. So what are you aware of? What happened for you doing that? Sure.
I found it really soothing. Something that was so interesting. After the third one, I felt this real kind of like release in my forehead and my face, like this kind of opening up.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. I feel sort of just calmer. Yeah. So I'm wondering, does anybody else feel like sort of more settled in their body after doing that?
I feel the same.
Sorry?
I feel the same.
You feel the same?
Like my teens would say, I feel regular. I feel regular.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, because I know about like you know, prosodic sounds and like kind of like lower register sounds and how that affects the vagus nerve, you know. So I was just kind of thinking about that, and I've never done sounding. Let me think about that. I rarely do sounding in my classes because sometimes they'll be like, oh, it's like chanting Om, right? And so I'm kind of wondering, kind of like incorporating this, how I might language around it. Like, what's the purpose? Like, what's not purpose? What's the, why did you pick Vu as opposed to any other vowels and sounds?
Yeah. Good question. Well, so I was trained with Vu. The Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing, is very big on Vu, and he what I've heard him ask this question, and he has said that the vibration, the vibration you feel in your abdomen is different from an Om sound. Mm-hmm. And so if you're feeling a little activated, it can help you feel a little more settled. And if you're in a freeze, it can help mobilize you a little bit, wake you up a little bit because of that the subdiaphragmatic vibration. And so it can sort of help you get more into regulation, whichever end of the spectrum you're on. And I didn't do this today, I should have really, but what I normally would do, and you know, I would guess if you were teaching you might want to do this, is ask first for people to notice what their body is feeling like. So they have sort of a little bit of a basis for comparison. Like do that and then do a few Vus, take a rest, and then see, so is everything the same? Is there anything that's different, worse, better, you know? And they might just say, well, I'm regular.
I guess what's coming up for me is, what do you do when a student is on hyper, like, arousal? Like, because I can't see, for example, these moments where I saw my students like fighting and they were like angry and, you know, like at that point, how do you bring them down? Because it's so difficult, right? You cannot say like, hey, stop, boo, like they're just like, you know? So do you have anything that you can, maybe a tool, something to help us kind of like, what do you do in that? Like obviously if they're fighting, that's a different thing because it's like, but when there's like the fight is over and they're still like, I wanna, you know, and there's nothing that really like helps you to kind of like, and it's tricky, right? Because like there's a part of you that I just want them to feel that anger and like, yeah, it's okay to be angry. You're angry because we're in a fight and whatever is arising is okay. But then like, how do you bring them to a more regulated state? Because I tried in both occasions, like, what do I do? Like to bring this kid back. He was just like up in the air, so
I get that. So I guess one way I would think about that is that when they're in that state and they're fighting and they're kind of eruptive, it's a very disorganized energy, right? It's just, right? And so what I would aim for is not trying to bring their energy down, but trying to organize that angry energy. So to make it go from like just chaotic eruption to something more focused. So, because they're angry and they have that energy in their body and it's not just going to go away by itself. So, I mean, one thing that, you know, if they're sort of regulated enough to take an instruction or a direct, you know, a suggestion, would be to, just show you. Well, this, I don't want to leave well over here. So to just like get in a nicely braced, you know, not braced, but grounded position and push really hard on the wall. And like imagine the wall's falling down and you have to hold it up. So what you really want is like a lot of energy and force in the arms. Because the motor impulse of our fight response is in our arms. And so you need to give it somewhere to go. And I've definitely, you know, if you really push hard and you're putting all your effort and focus into that, that takes a lot of energy. and you're in a different state when you're done doing that,
Yeah.
you know? And I've worked with kids where I had them do that, and I wouldn't recommend this, but I have sometimes in my office when it's just one-on-one, I had them push against my hands. But the wall is totally good. But I've seen kids sometimes just push so hard, and I've actually seen like sweat coming down the sides of their face, you know, because they're pushing with so much effort. And then there's like this moment where they just go, and they've been able to complete their fight response. And then they just don't have it in that way anymore, you know? And so trying to give them a way to let it move through their system, I think.
So the motor response is mostly, you said, in the arms, so not in the legs?
Well, I mean, the flight is in the legs.
Oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're talking about
Fight is more in the arms,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
okay. Mhm.
And you can ask also if they're pushing against the wall to notice where the push starts in their body. Like it might be at the bottom of their spine, you know, it might be in their shoulders, but try to get them to go further than the arms. Like where did it start before it even got into your arms? Where is that force coming from? You know, it might be in their core. So that's one thing I can think of. But I think that the gist of it is, how can you help organize that? Because they're not going to be able to sort of come into regulation at all while they've got.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have different things that I do, and these are with younger kids, but just for another example, if I have a child who's like in a really rageful state, I'll have them, either me alone or maybe with their parent, will hold out a big piece of newspaper, like, you know, the whole spread. Usually an adult is holding up each side so we can pull it really taut like a screen, and we'll have the kid like across the room, and I'll ask them to, you know, they're going to come and they're going to try to rip the paper in half with, you know, this way or punching or however they want to do it. But again, to organize them, I'll count down. So they're standing over there, and I'll say, okay, get all the force in your body, all that angry rage in your body, just feel it all coming up. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then whoa. And it's very organized. And the counting helps with that because it's giving them like a rhythm, a predictability. And it's incredibly satisfying when they can rip the newspaper, you know. And it's funny because it's not actually that easy to do. And so sometimes I'll tell them, like, you might have to try this 5 times before it's going to work, but I just want you to keep trying until you do it. And then when they do it, it's a completion. They ripped the paper, and it feels really great. So, you know, how that would translate to, you know, young adults, I'm not sure, but I guess I just wanted to name that as an illustration of the kind of thing we're going for. You don't want something that's going to bounce back, like punching a pillow, because that does nothing for you. It just, you know, you haven't changed anything.
Yeah.
But that's why I like the paper, because you actually can rip it.
Yeah.
But in boxing, like a weighted thing,
Mhm.
that's actually, that's similar?
You know, it's funny. I was wondering about that myself. Oops, cramp in my leg. I think you get, like, when you're punching a big weighted, I don't know what you call those things, but there's kind of a thud that you get, right? And it leaves an impression. So I'm guessing that might have, it doesn't just sort of bounce back at you, I don't think, because it's so strong. So I think that might give more of a completion feeling. That's my guess, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's interesting because I was teaching yesterday. These are with formerly incarcerated young people, and they're like doing a job readiness program, and we're talking about fight or flight, and we're just talking about like getting amped, right? So that's kind of like the language I was using, like, you know, when you feel amped, you know, and like you're ready to fight. And a young man said, well, like, what about boxers then? Aren't boxers just aggressive all the time? And so it just kind of clicked and made me think of this. Like, I was like, because I was saying, well, maybe the boxer has other regulation tools outside of the ring, right? Or it's competition, so it's a different kind of like use of their like brain, right? I mean, I was just kind of explaining it, but then this idea of like, well, actually in boxing, there's a very deliberate like movement of emotion, right? Or like movement of kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but yeah.
It's very organized.
That's, yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Shay,
Yeah, and they're trained to use their body in certain ways, right? And they're probably moving from the core.
Yeah.
It's not just disorganized chaos, because they'd be knocked out immediately, right?
And there's stillness. I mean, I know nothing about boxing, but if just thinking about watching it, it's not constant. It's stop, evaluate, right? It's like in music in between the notes, and I imagine that the most powerful boxers are also organizing the still spaces.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Their strategy.
Yes, right. I think. But I don't know. I mean, the professional boxers might be pretty aggressive a lot of the time.
Right. Yeah, and their whole, exactly,
Just like, the way Marines are. I mean, people who are trained to constantly amp up their fight or flight do tend to be very close to their threshold and able to override all the things in their system that tell them not to, like to go, or a fireman, like to put yourself into a dangerous situation. You have to override your whole system that's telling you run away from this.
Yes.
Yeah. So when people are trained to do that, that I think they're kind of in a different category. Yeah.
Well, also when you face like trauma, and then you're just like constantly being re-triggered, right? And so it's that trigger too. It's like, well, I'm not, even if I'm trained to do it and I'm cognitively know that this is, but when you're triggered, you just don't know.
Right,
and so I think that's the thing with our young people. They're not perhaps feeling trauma in the moment, or at least in our class, right? But then it's like very easily getting triggered, right? And so like, how do you re-regulate after a trigger? And I think that's the kind of how we try to navigate our space, because otherwise when a young person's triggered, that can like trigger so many other nervous systems, right?
Right, absolutely, yes. Right.
So is holding plank similar to this then?
Because of the way you're using your arms? Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated by this, and I love that question, and I think that this is, I don't know, I'm just picturing our young people just like, especially the young men, they're just like doing push all the time, right? So, maybe just, because the body has so much wisdom, right? So maybe they think I'm doing this for physical strength, but maybe their body's like, do something, right? To kind of re-regulate, and I think that's such a fascinating thing, the body's wisdom to be like, let's bust out 50 push-ups, because I'm feeling like a little like, not regular right now, like
exactly.
And you see that. You see the students opt into push-ups at the most random times, but maybe it's not so random.
That's really interesting.
Like I think about some of my guys, and like I have one that just like he needs to come into the room, he needs to bang out 15, and I'm like, bang out 15, like maybe like your body's telling you gotta do that. But it wasn't until now that I made that connection that maybe it's the body being really wise for that child, and what needs to be removed or released or acknowledged. But I think what's really important for us as teachers is to hold space for that and to organize it in a way that's not reactivating for them or shaming them in what their body's telling them that they need.
Right.
Interesting.
I'm sure this is something that you guys are all aware of anyway, but inversion can also be really helpful for settling. And so it's not, if somebody's feeling threatened, they wouldn't want to do that because it's a kind of vulnerable position. But, sometimes I'll have a young person or a kid, lie down with their butt in the corner there and their legs up on the wall. Or I'll sort of teach them to do that at home when they get upset. And it just helps their whole system kind of calm down a little bit,
So that's when they're upset and not angry, right? Because they don't necessarily need like a completion of the emotion.
Well, if that's like I tell them if they can catch themselves like in the yellow zone before they go
Yeah.
into the red zone.
Okay, right,
That's
right.
a way to dial
Yeah.
down their system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then use the newspaper if they're in the red zone.
Yeah. Exactly. Right.
Mm.
Right. Yeah. Are there other questions or things that anybody would like to bring up? I feel as though, I think we've kind of covered most of what I was hoping we would do today. I guess I just want to return for a few minutes to the nervous system theory and how, just going back to that to circle back. So when you think about being in social engagement, that is what that is the way to inhibit a fight or flight or freeze response, is being in social engagement. So one thing that I'm sort of that I always have on my mind is how can we support moving people into social engagement? Mm-hmm. So that's through through voice, through feeling oriented in the space that people are in, not sitting in a frozen way, just getting people to move their heads and necks, whether it's looking around the room or, even just coming up with some like exercise where this is what they're doing, asking them to listen for 3 sounds in the room, which does a few things. The same as like looking for things your eyes want to land on, listening for sounds, finding a few different things you can touch, so you're getting different tactile input. What these things do is they get us to experience the moment through our sensory channels, right? And when it just brings us into the here and now. So when you're doing those things, when you're listening and looking and touching, you're not thinking about what happened before, and you're not worrying about what's about to happen. You're just exactly in your environment.
I wonder about games also. I know that I've heard Chetty talk about like games and there's like a ball game that sometimes folks do in Lineage, or that's also bringing the social engagement system online
Yes.
and bringing people into the moment.
You mean like rolling a ball around the circle?
Yeah, throwing a ball around,
yeah.
or like clap games, or like
Yes.
improv games, like just things that get people engaged
That's
with
right.
each other and
when you're using
in
eye
syncopation.
contact, yeah.
Yeah.
Rhythm, absolutely. Rhythm
exactly.
is really important. And yes. Simple things like mirroring games are great for that, because you have to notice what the other person's doing and then do it together with them. So that's a kind of co-regulation when you're mirroring. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Games are really helpful for that.
But this is specifically because of the ventral vagal system is like here,
Mhm.
right? So
Mhm.
like you're talking about like how to get people socially engaged by specifically engaging here.
That's right.
Like this part of
That's
the
right.
body, right? So
Yes.
games, because sometimes we have games that are just like whole body games, right?
Uh-huh.
Which is like fun, and that could be linking, but I think it's thinking about even the throwing games, it's like because you're making eye contact
That's
with the person,
right.
or you're like you're looking around, you say the person's name, so just in terms of even how we language or how we kind of teach these things to like as a note to ourselves, thinking like how do we really like focus in on here.
That's right.
Yeah.
So listening and looking and using our voices
Yeah.
in a friendly way.
Yeah.
Yep, all of those. Yeah.
So I have a question then, because this happens a lot when like people are triggered or they're in kind of a sympathetic activation. That even if someone even if someone else, say I'm activated and I look at you and you have like a neutral, or even you're smiling, I can interpret that as a threat,
Threatening,
right?
yeah.
So then how do then I best engage with that person in terms of like how I speak to them, how I interact with them, how do I fix my face? How do you fix your face if I'm activated?
Yeah. I think what I would tend to do is to focus on my own regulation. I would check my breathing. I do that a lot. If I'm feeling like the other person is reactive toward me, I just try to stay as regulated as I can inside my own body. That's the best thing I can do, I think. Is to make sure, okay, am I breathing fully? And does my face feel relaxed? You know, if I feel like I'm getting tense or, you know, then that's going to be communicated. And of course, I can't control, like, lots of traumatized people do see neutral as negative, or even friendly as threatening. It's true. And we only have so much control over that, but I think our optimal way is to stay regulated ourselves. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So I think that might be a good place for us to land today. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm really glad. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you. And thanks, Jessica. I know a ton of behind the scenes and